Maggie could tell by the footsteps that the man outside her door was drunk. The footsteps were unsteady, and the man had just lurched into the wall, though it was early morning. A man so drunk at that hour of the morning that he could not walk steadily might have been drinking all night. The thought made her very apprehensive, so apprehensive that she considered not opening her door. A man that drunk might well be violent. He might beat her or tear her clothes. Maybe he would be quick and pass out. That sometimes happened with men who were very drunk, but that was about the best that she could expect if she opened her door to a drunk. Some drunks merely wallowed on her, unable to finish, or the exertion might agitate the man's stomach. More than once men had thrown up on her or fouled her bed with vomit. For Maggie it had never been easy opening her door to a man. Once the door was open, she was caught. If a bad man or a cruel man was standing there, then she was in for a bad time. Sometimes, of course, the customer outside her door would just be some unhappy man whose wife had passed away. Those men who were just looking for a little pleasure or comfort were not a problem. The men she feared were the men who wanted to punish women. That was the chief peril of her profession. Maggie had endured many sweaty, desperate times dealing with such men. She always opened the door, though. Not opening it could cause consequences just as grave. The man outside might grow angry enough to break down the door, in which case the landlord might throw her out. At the very least, she would have to pay for the door. Besides that, the customer might go to the sheriff and complain. He might claim that she had stolen money, that or some other accusation. The word of any man, however dishonest, was more with a sheriff than the word of a whore. Or the aggrieved customer might complain to his friends and stir them up. Several times gangs of men had caught her, egged on by some dissatisfied customer. Those times had been bad. Much as it might frighten her to open her door, Maggie never let herself forget that she was a whore and had to live by certain rules. One being that you opened the door to the customer before the customer got mad enough to break it down. Still, it was her room. She felt she could at least take her time buttoning her dress. It was important to her that her dress be buttoned modestly before she let a man into her room. She knew it might seem contradictory, since the man outside was coming in to pay her to unbutton the same dress. But Maggie still buttoned up. She felt that if she ever started opening the door with her dress unbuttoned, she would lose all hope for herself. There was time enough to do what she had to do when the man had paid his money. She opened the door cautiously and received a grim shock. The person who had just lurched down the hall was the young ranger Jake Spoon, who had only been in the troop a few weeks. He was so drunk that he had dropped to his knees and was holding his stomach. But when he saw Maggie, he mastered his gut and put out a hand so she could help him up. "Why, Mr. Spoon," Maggie said, "are you sickly?" Instead of answering, Jake Spoon crawled past her into her room. Once inside, he got to his feet and walked unsteadily across the room to her bed. Then he sat down on the bed and began to pull off his boots and unbutton his shirt. Jake Spoon looked up at her mutely. He seemed to be puzzled by the fact that she was still standing in the doorway. "I got money," he said. "I ain't a cheat." Then he pulled his shirt off, dropped it on the floor, and stood up, holding onto a bedpost to steady himself. Without even looking at her again, he opened his pants. Maggie felt her heart sink. Jake was a Texas Ranger, although just come to the troop. In the years that Maggie had been seeing Woodrow call, it had become known to the Rangers that she and Woodrow had an attachment. It was not yet the sort of attachment that Maggie yearned for. If it had been, she would not have been renting a cheap room and opening her door to drunken strangers. But it was an attachment. She wanted it, and Woodrow wanted it, though he might have been slow to admit it. Sensing the attachment, the other Rangers who knew Woodrow well had gradually begun to leave Maggie alone. They soon realized that it was distasteful to her to be selling herself to Woodrow's friends. Though Call never said anything directly, the Rangers could tell that he didn't like it if one of them went with Maggie. Augustus McCrae, an indiscriminate horror, would never think of approaching Maggie, although he had long admired her looks and her deportment. Indeed, Gus had often urged Woodrow to marry Maggie and end her chancy life as a whore, a life that so often led to sickness or death at an early age. Woodrow had so far declined to marry her, but lately he had been more helpful and more generous with money. Now he sometimes gave her money to buy things for her room, small conveniences that she couldn't afford. It was her deepest hope and fondest dream that Woodrow would someday forbid her to whore. Maybe what they had wouldn't go as far as marriage, but at least it might remove her from the rough traffic that had been her life. Woodrow's argument the few times they had approached the subject was that he was often gone for months on hazardous patrols, any one of which could result in his death. He felt Maggie ought to take care of herself and continue to earn what she could in case he was cut down in battle. Of course, Maggie knew that rangering was dangerous and that Woodrow might be killed, in which case her dream of a life with him would never be realized. She never spoke of her life as a whore when she was with Woodrow. In her own mind, her real life was their life. The rest of it she tried to pretend was happening to someone else. But the pretense was only a lie, she told herself, to help her get through the days. In fact, it was her who opened her door to the men, who took their money, who inspected them to see that they were not diseased, who accepted them into her body. She had been a desperate girl with both parents dead when she was led into whoring in San Antonio. Now she was no longer a girl, but the desperation was still with her. She felt it even then, as Jake Spoon stood there in her room, drunk almost to the point of nausea, with his pants open, pointing himself at her and waiting sullenly. Woodrow didn't know about her desperation. Maggie had never told him how much she hated what she did. He might have sensed it at times, but he didn't know how hard it was, on a morning when all she wanted to do was sit quietly and sew, to have to deal with a man so drunk that he had to crawl into her room. Worse than that, he was a ranger, the same as Woodrow. He ought to have known to seek another whore. "Why are you standing over there? I'm ready," Jake said. His pants had slipped down to his ankles. He had to bend to pull them up so he could dig into his pocket and come out with the coins. "But you're sickly, Mr. Spoon. You can barely stand up," Maggie said, trying to think of some stratagem that would cause him to get dressed again and go away. "Don't need to stand up, and I ain't sick," Jake said, though to his dismay the act of speaking almost caused his stomach to come up. He swayed for a moment, but fought the nausea down. It was the whore's fault, he decided. She hadn't come over to help him with his clothes, as a whore should. He fumbled again for the coins and finally got them out of his pocket. Looking at the whore, who had closed the door behind her but still stood across the room staring at him, Jake felt his anger rising. Her name was Maggie, he knew. The boys all said she was sweet on Woodrow Call, but Woodrow Call was far up the plains, and the warning meant little to Jake. All whores were sweet on somebody. "Come here, I got the money," he demanded. In his mind, which swirled from drink, was the recent memory of the wild games he had played with Inez Skull, acts so raw that even whores might not do them. He didn't like it that the whore he had chosen was so standoffish. What of it if she was sweet on Woodrow Call? Maggie saw there was no way out of it, without risking the sheriff or a worse calamity. In another minute the young ranger would start yelling, or else do her violence. She didn't want the yelling or the violence, which might lead to her having to move from the room she had tried to make into a pleasant place for Woodrow to visit when he was home. She didn't want to get thrown out, so she went across the room and accepted Jake Spoon's money. She didn't look Jake in the eye. She tried to make herself small. Maybe, if she was lucky, the boy would just do it and go. Maggie wasn't lucky, though. The minute she took Jake's money, he drew back his hand and slapped her hard in the face. Jake slapped the whore because he was angry with her for being so standoffish and lingering so long, but he also gave her the slap because that was how Madame Skull had started things with him. The minute he walked upstairs, she would come out of the bedroom and slap his face. The next thing he knew, they would be on the floor, tussling fiercely. Then they would do the raw things. He wanted again what he had had with Inez Skull. He didn't understand why she had cut his hair and thrown him out. Her coldness upset him so that he stole a bottle of whiskey from a shed behind the saloon and drank the whole bottle down. The whiskey burned at first and then numbed him a little, but it didn't cool the fever he felt at the memory of his hot tusslings with Inez Skull. Only a woman could cool that fever, and the handiest woman happened to be Woodrow Call's whore. She had very white skin, the whore. When he slapped her, her cheek became immediately red. But the slap didn't set things off, as it had when Madame Skull slapped him. Maggie, Call's whore, didn't utter a sound. She didn't slap him back or grab him or do anything wild or raw. She just put the money away, took off her dress, and lay back on the bed waiting. She wouldn't even so much as look at him, although in an effort to make her a little more lively, he pulled her hair. But neither the slap nor the hair-pulling worked at all, except for flexing herself a little when he crawled on top of her. The whore didn't move a muscle, or speak, or cry out, or yell, or bite, or even sigh. She didn't scream and kick and jerk as Madame Skull did every time they were together. As soon as the young ranger finished, it took considerably longer than she had hoped. Maggie got off the bed and went behind a little screen to clean herself. She meant to stay behind the screen, hiding until Jake Spoon left. She knew she would have a bad bruise on her cheek from the slap. She didn't want to see the young man again if she could help it. Again, though, Maggie was not lucky. While she was cleaning herself, she heard Jake retching and went out to find him on his hands and knees again. At least he was vomiting in a basin. He had not ruined the new carpet she had saved up to buy. Jake Spoon heaved and heaved. Maggie saw how young he was and took a little pity. When he finished being sick, she cleaned him up a little and helped him out the door. "Now, boys, look there," Inish Skull said, pointing westward at a small red butte. "See that? Pretend it's your Alps." "Our what, Captain?" Longbill inquired. It was breakfast time. Dietz had just fried up some tasty bacon, and the breeze, though chilly, could be tolerated, particularly while he was sitting at the campfire holding a tin mug of scalding coffee that in texture was almost as thick as mud. All the rangers were hunched over their cups, letting the steam from the scalding coffee warm their cold faces. The exception was Woodrow Call, already saddled up and ready to ride, though even he had no notion of where they were headed or why. They had traveled due south for a few days, but then the captain suddenly bent to the west, toward a long, empty space where, so far as any of the rangers knew, there was nothing to see or do. The low, flat-topped hill was red in the morning sunlight. "The Alps, Mr. Coleman," the captain repeated. "If you find yourself in Switzerland or France, you have to cross them before you can get to Italy and eat the tasty noodle. That was Hannibal's challenge. He had all those elephants, but the Alpine passes were deep in snow. What was he to do?" Captain Skull was drinking brandy, his morning drink and his evening drink, too, when he could have it. One well-padded brace of saddlebags contained nothing but brandy. A tipple or swallow or two in the morning cleared his head wonderfully when he was campaigning, and also rarely failed to put him in a pedagogical mood. History, military history in particular, was his passion. Harvard wanted him to teach it, but he saw no reason to be teaching military history when he could go out in the field and make it, so he packed up the ardent Dolly Johnson, his Birmingham bride, and went to Texas to fight in the Mexican War, where he promptly captured 3 substantial towns and a number of sad villages. The air of the raw frontier so invigorated him that he gave little thought to going back to Boston to the library and the ivied hall. Because of his long string of victories in Mexico, he was soon offered the command of the disheveled but staunch band of irregulars known as the Texas Rangers. Inish Skull was convinced from what he knew of politics that a great civil conflict was looming in America, but that conflict was yet some years away. When it came, Inish Skull meant to have a generalship, and what better way to capture the attention of the War Department than to whip the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Apache, the Pawnee, or any other tribe that attempted to resist the advance of Anglo-Saxon settlement. Skull might not have broken the wild tribes yet, but he had harried them vigorously for almost 10 years, while little by little settlement crept up the rivers and into the fertile valleys. Farms and ranches were established, burned out by the red men, and built again. Small, poor townships were formed, wagon roads rutted the prairie, and the government slowly placed its line of forts along the northern and western line of settlement. All the while, Skull and his rangers ranged and ranged, hanging cattle thieves in the south and challenging the fighting Indians to the north. Still, now and then, with a prickle of brandy in his nostrils and a cold wind worthy of New England cooling his neck, Skull found that the professor was likely to revive in him a little. At moments he missed the learned talk of Cambridge, At times he grew depressed when he considered the gap in knowledge between himself and the poor dull fellows he commanded. They were brave beyond reason, but alas, untutored. Young Call, it was true, was eager to learn, and Augustus McCrae sometimes mimicked a few lines of Latin picked up in some Tennessee school. But the truth was the men were ignorant, which is why, from time to time, with no immediate enemy to confront, he had started giving little impromptu lectures on the great battles of history. It was true that the little butte to the west did not look much like an Alp, but it was the only hill in sight and would have to serve. No, you see, Hannibal and his elephants were on the wrong side of the hills, or at least he wanted his enemies to think so, Skull said, pacing back and forth, his brandy glass in his hand. He hated to drink brandy out of anything but glass. On every patrol he carefully wrapped and packed 6 brandy glasses, but despite his caution he would usually be reduced to taking his brandy out of a tin cup before the scout was finished. "What was he doing with elephants if he was out there in the snows?" Augustus asked. He hated it when the captain got in one of his lecturing moods. Though, since as far as he could tell they were just wandering aimlessly now, it probably didn't much matter whether they were riding or getting a history lesson. Now there the captain was, drunk on brandy, pointing at some dull little hill and prattling on about Hannibal and elephants and snow and Alps and Romans. Gus could not remember ever having heard of Hannibal, and he did not expect to enjoy any lecture he might receive, mainly because one of his socks had wrinkled up inside his boot somehow and left him a painful blister on the bottom of his foot. He wanted to be back in Austin. If he limped into the Forsythe store looking pitiful enough, Clara might tend to his blister and permit him a kiss besides. Instead, all he had in the way of comfort was a mug of coffee and a piece of sandy bacon, and even that comfort was ending. Dietz had just confided in him that they only had bacon for one more day. "Why, Hannibal was African," Skull said. "He was a man of Carthage, and not the only great commander to use war elephants either. Alexander the Great used them in India, and Hannibal took his on over the Alps, snow or no snow, and fell on the Romans when they least expected it. Brilliant fighting, I call it." Call tried to imagine the scene the captain was describing, the great beasts winding up and up into the snowy passes. But he had never seen an elephant, just a few pictures of them in books. Though he knew most of the rangers found it boresome when the captain started in lecturing, he himself enjoyed hearing about the battles Captain Skull described. His reading ability was slowly improving, enough so that he hoped in time to read about some of the battles himself. Just as the captain was warming to his subject, Famous Shoes suddenly appeared, almost at the captain's elbow. As usual, all the boys gave a start. None of them had seen the tracker approach. Even Captain Skull found Famous Shoes' sudden appearances a little unnerving. "I was in the camp of Buffalo Hump. He has a new wife," Famous Shoes said. "His son took me prisoner for a while. He was the one who killed Mr. Watson. They call him Blue Duck. His mother was a Mexican woman who froze to death trying to get away from Buffalo Hump." Einar Skull smiled. "You'd make a fine professor, sir," he said. "You've managed to tell us more about this scamp Blue Duck than I've been able to get across about Hannibal and his elephants. What else should I know? Has Kicking Wolf crossed the Alps with those stallions yet?" His witticism was lost on Famous Shoes, who did not particularly appreciate interruptions while trying to deliver his reports. "Slow Tree came into camp with many warriors and many women," Famous Shoes went on. "Slow Tree wanted to kill me, but Buffalo Hump will not let anybody kill me." "Whoa, that's news. Why not?" Skull asked. "I helped his grandmother die," Famous Shoes said. "I do not have to worry about Buffalo Hump." "Is that all?" Skull asked. "You do not have to worry about Buffalo Hump either," Famous Shoes said. "He is still with Slow Tree, but Kicking Wolf is following you now." "Kicking Wolf? Why, the rascal!" Skull exclaimed. "A few days ago I was following him. Why would the man we were chasing want to follow us?" "He probably wants to steal more horses," Call said. "Stealing horses is what he's good at." "It could be that, or he might mean to cut our throats," Einar Skull commented. He looked at the scout, but Famous Shoes seemed to have no opinion as to Kicking Wolf's plans. "I didn't see him," he said. "I only saw his tracks. He has 3 birds with him." "Well, that doesn't tell me much," Skull said. "I've not had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Three-Birds. What kind of fellow is he?" "Three-Birds is quiet. He does not speak his thoughts," Famous Shoes said. "The two of them are alone. The rest of the warriors are at the feast Buffalo Hump is giving for Slow Tree." "If it's just the two of them, I say let 'em come," Augustus said. "I expect we can handle 2 Indians, even if one of 'em is Kicking Wolf." Call thought the opposite. 2 Indians would be harder to detect than 15. It struck him as peculiar that Kicking Wolf chose to follow them just then. After all, he had just escaped with 3 fine stallions. They were probably better horses than any the ranger troop could boast, with the exception of Hector, of course. Skull strode up and down for a while, looking across the plain, as if he expected to see Kicking Wolf heave into sight at any moment. But, except for 2 hawks soaring, there was nothing to see in any direction but grass. "I have known Three-Birds for a long time," he said. "He does not hate Kickapoos. Once I helped him track a cougar he had shot. I think that cougar might have got away if I hadn't tracked it with him." Augustus was sometimes irked by Famous Shoes' pompous way of talking. "I expect he's forgot about that cougar by now," he said. "He might step up and cut your throat before he could call it to mind." Famous Shoes considered the remark too absurd to reply to. Three-Birds would never forget that he had helped him track the cougar, any more than Buffalo Hump would forget that he had been kind to his dying grandmother. "Want me to see if I can surprise him, Captain?" Call asked. He was impatient with the inactivity. Talk was fine at night, but it was daytime, and his horse was saddled and eager. "You can't catch them," Famous Shoes said. "They are following you, but they are not close, and they have better horses than you do. If you chase them, they will lead you so far away that you will starve before you can get back." Call ignored the scout and looked at the captain. He saw no reason to tolerate a hostile pursuit. Captain Skull looked at the young man with amusement. He obviously wanted to go chase Indians, despite the scout's plain warning. "I've been out there before, and I didn't starve," Call informed him. Skull pursed his lips but said nothing. He walked over to his saddlebags and rummaged in them until he came out with a small book. Then he walked back to the campfire, settled himself comfortably on a sack of potatoes, and held up the book, which was well used. "Xenophon," he said. "The March of the 10,000. Of course, we're only 12 men, but when I read Xenophon, I can imagine that we're 10,000. Augustus had quietly saddled up. If there was a pursuit, he wanted to be part of it. Several other rangers began to stir themselves, pulling on their boots and looking to their guns. "Here, stop that," Captain Skull said suddenly, looking up from his book. "I won't send you off to chase a phantom in country this spare. Just because Mr. Call didn't starve in it on his last visit doesn't mean he couldn't starve tomorrow, and the rest of you too. There's always a first time, they say," he added. "I expect it was some smart Greek said that, or else our own Papa Franklin." Then he paused and smiled benignly at his confused and ragged men. "Ever hear Greek, Red boys?" he asked. "It's a fine old language, the language of Homer and Thucydides, not to mention Xenophon, who's our author today. I've a fair amount of Greek still in my head. I'll read to you, if you like, about the 10,000 men who marched home in defeat." Nobody said yes, and nobody said no. The men just stood where they were, or sat if they had not yet risen. Dietz put a few more sticks on the fire. "That's fine, the eyes have it," Captain Skull said. He looked around with a grin, and then, sitting on the sack of potatoes and squinting in order to see the small print of his pocket Xenophon, he read to the troop in Greek. "That was worse than listening to a bunch of Comanches gobble at one another," Long Bill said once the reading was over and the troop once again on the move. "I'd rather listen to pigs squeal than to hear goings-on like that," Ikey Ripple added. Augustus had disliked the reading as much as anyone, but the fact that Long Bill had spoken out against it rubbed him the wrong way. "That was Greek," he reminded them haughtily. "Everybody ought to hear Greek now and then, and Latin too. I could listen all day to someone read Latin." Call knew that Augustus claimed some knowledge of Latin, but he had never been convinced by the claim. "I doubt you know a word of either language," Call said. "You didn't understand that reading, and neither did anybody else." Unlike the Rangers, Famous Shoes had been mightily impressed by the captain's reading. He himself could speak several dialects and follow the track of any living animal, but Captain Skull had followed an even harder and more elusive track, the tiny, intricate track that ran across the pages of the book. That big horse Skull could follow a little track through page after page of a book and turn what he saw into sound was a feat that never ceased to amaze the Kickapoo. "That might be the way a god talks," he commented. "Nope, it was just some old Greek fella who lost a war and had to tramp back home with his 10,000 men," Augustus said. "That's a lot of men," Call said. "I wonder how many fought on the side that won." "Why would you care, Woodrow? You didn't even like hearing Greek," Augustus pointed out. "No," Call said, "but I can still wonder about that war." Kicking Wolf was amused by the carelessness of Big Horse Skull, who put 3 men at a time to guard the rangers' horses and the 2 pack mules, but did not bother with guards for the buffalo horse. The men on guard were rotated at short intervals, too, yet Skull did not seem to think the buffalo horse needed watching. "He does not think anyone would try to steal the buffalo horse," Kicking Wolf told 3 birds after they had watched the rangers and their horses for 3 nights. "Skull is careless," he added. 3 birds, for once, had a thought he didn't want to keep inside himself. "Big Horse is right," 3 birds said. He pointed upward to the heavens, which were filled with bright stars. "There are as many men as there are stars," 3 birds said. "They are not all here, but somewhere in the world there are that many men." "What are you talking about?" Kicking Wolf said. 3 birds pointed to the North Star, a star much brighter than the little sprinkle of stars around it. "Only one star shines to show where the north is," 3 birds said. "Only one star of all the stars shines for the north." Kicking Wolf was thinking it was pleasanter when 3 birds didn't try to speak his thoughts, but he tried to listen politely to 3 birds' harmless words about the stars. "You are like the North Star," 3 birds said. "Only you of all the men in the world could steal the buffalo horse. That horse might be a witch. Some say that it can fly. It might turn and eat you when you go up to it. Yet you are such a thief that you are going to steal it anyway. Big Horse doesn't know that the North Star has come to take his horse," he added. "If he knew, he would be more careful." On the 4th night, after studying the situation well, Kicking Wolf decided it was time to approach the buffalo horse. The weather conditions were good. There was a 3/4 moon, and the brightness of the stars was dimmed just enough by scudding, fast-moving clouds. Kicking Wolf could see all he needed to see. He had carefully prepared himself by fasting, his bowels were empty, and he had rubbed sage all over his body. Skull even left a halter on the buffalo horse. Once Kicking Wolf had reassured the big horse with his touch and his stroking, all he would have to do would be to take the halter and quietly lead the buffalo horse away. As he was easing along the ground on his belly so that the lazy guards wouldn't see him, Kicking Wolf got a big shock. Suddenly the buffalo horse raised its ear, turned its head, and looked right at him. Kicking Wolf was close enough then that he could see the horse's breath making little white clouds in the cold night. When he realized that the buffalo horse knew he was there, Kicking Wolf remembered 3 birds' warning that the horse might be a witch. For an instant, Kicking Wolf felt fear, big fear. In a second or two, the big horse could be on him, trampling him or biting him before he could crawl away. Immediately, Kicking Wolf rose to a crouch and got out of sight of the buffalo horse as fast as he could. He was very frightened, and he had not been frightened during the theft of a horse in many years. The buffalo horse had smelled him even though he had no smell, and heard him even though he made no sound. "I think he heard my breath," he said when he was safely back with 3 birds. "A man cannot stop his breath." "The other horses didn't know you were there," 3 birds told him. "Only the buffalo horse noticed you." Though he was not ready to admit it, Kicking Wolf had begun to believe that 3 birds might be right. The buffalo horse might be a witch horse, a horse that could not be stolen. "We could shoot it and see if it dies," 3 birds suggested. "If it dies, it is not a witch horse. "Be quiet," Kicking Wolf said. "I don't want to shoot it, I want to steal it." "Why?" Three Birds asked. He could not quite fathom why Kicking Wolf had taken it into his head to steal the buffalo horse. Certainly it was a big, stout horse whose theft would embarrass the Texans, but Three Birds took a practical view. If it was a witch horse, as he believed, then it could not be stolen. And if it wasn't a witch horse, then it was only another animal, an animal that would die someday, like all animals. He did not understand why Kicking Wolf wanted it so badly. "It is the great horse of the Texans. It is the best horse in the world," Kicking Wolf said when he saw Three Birds looking at him quizzically. Once he calmed down, he decided he had been too hasty in his judgment. Probably the buffalo horse wasn't a witch horse at all. Probably it just had an exceptionally keen nose. He decided to follow the rangers another day or two so he could watch the horse a little more closely. It was aggravating to him that Famous Shoes, the Kickapoo tracker, was with the Texans. Famous Shoes was bad luck, Kicking Wolf thought. He was a cranky man who was apt to turn up anywhere, usually just when you didn't want to see him. He enjoyed the protection of Buffalo Hump, though, otherwise some Comanche would have killed him long ago. The old men said that Famous Shoes could talk to animals. They believed that there had been a time when all people had been able to talk freely with animals to exchange bits of information that might be helpful one to another. There were even a few people who supposed that Kicking Wolf himself could talk to horses. Otherwise, how could he persuade them to follow him quietly out of herds that were well guarded by the whites? Kicking Wolf knew that was silly. He could not talk to horses, and he wasn't sure that anyone could talk to animals anymore. But the old people insisted that some few humans still retained the power to talk with birds and beasts, and they thought Kicking Wolf might be such a person. Kicking Wolf doubted it, but then some of the old ones were very wise. They might know more about the matter than he did. If the Kickapoo tracker could really talk to animals, then he might have spoken to the buffalo horse and told him Kicking Wolf meant to steal him. Whether he could talk to animals or not, Famous Shoes was an exceptional tracker. He would certainly be aware that he and Three Birds were following the Texans. But he was a curious man. He might not have taken the trouble to mention this fact to the Texans. He might only have told the buffalo horse, feeling that was all that was necessary. It was while watching the buffalo horse make water one evening that Kicking Wolf remembered old Kata, the grandfather of Heavyleg, Buffalo Hump's oldest wife. Kata, too, had been a great horse thief. He was not very free with his secrets, but once, while drunk, he had mentioned to Kicking Wolf that the way to steal difficult horses was to approach them while they were pissing. When a horse made water, it had to stretch out. It could not move quickly once its flow started. Kicking Wolf had already noticed that the buffalo horse made water for an exceptionally long time. The big horse would stretch out, his legs spread and his belly close to the ground, and would pour out a hot yellow stream for several minutes. If Big Horse Skull was mounted when this happened, he sometimes took a book out of his saddlebags and read it. On one occasion, while the buffalo horse was pissing, Skull did something very strange, something that went with the view that the buffalo horse was a witch horse. Skull slipped backward onto the big horse's rump, put his head on the saddle, and raised his legs. He stood on his head in the saddle while the buffalo horse pissed. Of course, it was not unusual for men who were good riders to do feats of horsemanship. Comanche riders, particularly young riders, did them all the time. But neither Kicking Wolf nor Three Birds had ever seen a rider stand on his head while a horse was pissing. "I think Big Horse is crazy," Three Birds said when he saw that. Those were his last words on the subject, and his only words on any subject for several days. Three Birds decided he had been talking too much. He went back to his old habit of keeping his thoughts inside himself. Kicking Wolf decided he should wait until the buffalo horse was pissing before he approached him again. It would require patience because horses did not always make water at night. They were more apt to wait and relieve themselves in the early morning. When he mentioned his intention to Three Birds merely made a gesture indicating that he was not in the mood to speak. Then, that very night, opportunity came. The men who were around the campfire were all singing. The Texans sang almost every night, even if it was cold. Kicking Wolf was not far from the buffalo horse when the big horse began to stretch out. As soon as the stream of piss was flowing from the horse's belly, Kicking Wolf moved, and this time the big horse did not look around. In a minute, Kicking Wolf was close to him and grasped the halter. The buffalo horse gave a little snort of surprise, but that was all. All the time the buffalo horse was pissing, Kicking Wolf stroked him, as he had stroked the many horses he had stolen. When the yellow water ceased to flow, Kicking Wolf pulled on the halter, and to his relief the big horse followed him. The great horse moved as quietly as he did, a fact that for a moment frightened Kicking Wolf. Maybe he was not the one playing the trick. Maybe the buffalo horse was a witch horse, in which case the horse might be following so quietly only in order to get him off somewhere and eat him. Soon, though, they were almost a mile from the ranger camp, and the buffalo horse had not eaten him or given him any trouble at all. It was following as meekly as a donkey, or more meekly. Few donkeys were meek. Then Kicking Wolf felt a great surge of pride. He had done what no other Comanche warrior could have done. He had stolen the buffalo horse, the greatest horse that he had ever taken, the greatest horse the Texans owned. He walked another mile, and then mounted the buffalo horse and rode slowly to where he had left Three Birds. He did not want to gallop, not yet. None of the rangers were alert enough to pick up a horse's gallop at that distance, but Famous Shoes was there, and he might put his ear to the ground and hear the gallop. Three Birds was in some kind of trance when Kicking Wolf rode up to him. Three Birds had their horses ready, but he himself was sitting on a blanket praying. The man often prayed at inconvenient times. When he looked up from his prayer and saw Kicking Wolf coming on the buffalo horse, all he said was, "Ho! I have stolen the buffalo horse," Kicking Wolf said. "You shouldn't be sitting on that dirty blanket praying. You should be making a good song about what I have done tonight. I went to the buffalo horse while he was making water, and I stole him. When Big Horse Skull gets up in the morning, he will be so angry he will want to make a great war on us." Three Birds thought that what Kicking Wolf said was probably true. Skull would make a great war because his horse had been stolen. He immediately stopped praying and caught his horse. "Let's go a long way now," he said. "All those Texans will be chasing us when it gets light." "We will go a long way, but don't forget to make the song," Kicking Wolf said. "Genius! It's absolute genius," Einar Skull said when told that his great war horse Hector had been stolen. "The man took Hector right out from under my nose. The other horses, now that took skill, but stealing Hector? That's genius." It was hardly the reaction the Rangers had expected. The four men on guard at the time, Long Bill Coleman, P.I. Parker, Neely Dickens, and Finch Seeger, were lined up with hangdog looks on their faces. All of them expected the firing squad. After all, they had let the most important horse in Texas get stolen. None of them had seen or heard a thing either. The big horse had been grazing peacefully the last time they had looked. They'd been expecting Kicking Wolf to try for the other horses. It hadn't occurred to any of them that he might steal the big horse. "You should have expected it," Call told them sternly when the theft was discovered. "He might be big, but he was still a horse, and horses are what Kicking Wolf steals." Augustus McCrae, like Captain Skull, could not suppress a sneaking admiration for Kicking Wolf's daring. It was a feat so bold it had to be credited, and he told Woodrow as much. "I don't credit it," Call said. "It's still just a thief stealing a horse. We ought to be chasing him instead of standing around talking about it." "We've been chasing him off and on for 10 years and we ain't caught him," Gus pointed out. "The man's too fleet for us. I'd like to see you go into Buffalo Hump's camp and steal one of his horses sometime." "I don't claim to be a horse thief," Call said. "The reason we don't catch him is because we stop to sleep and he don't." Call felt a deep irritation at what had happened. The irritation was familiar. He had felt it almost every time they had gone after the Comanches. In a direct conflict they might win, if the conflict went on long enough for their superior weaponry to prevail, but few engagements with the Comanche involved direct conflict. It was chase and wait, thrust and parry, and always the Comanches concentrated on what they were doing while the Rangers usually piddled. Their own preparations were seldom thorough or their tactics precise. The Comanches were supposed to be primitive, yet they fought with more intelligence than the Rangers were usually able to muster. It irked Call, and had always irked him. He resolved that if he ever got to be a captain, he would plan better and press the enemy harder once a battle was joined. Of course, the force they had to deploy was not large. Captain Skull, like Buffalo Hump, preferred to mount a small, quick, mobile troop. Yet in Call's view there was always something ragtag about the ranger forces he went out with. Some of the men would always be drunk or in love with a whore or deep into a gambling frenzy when the time came to leave. They would be left behind while men who were barely skilled enough to manage town life would join up, wanting a grand adventure. Also, the state of Texas allotted little money for the ranger force. Now that the Comanches had stopped snatching children from the outskirts of Austin and San Antonio, the legislature saw no need to be generous with the rangers. "They don't need us anymore, the damn politicians," Augustus said. He had become increasingly resentful of all forms of law and restraint. The result of the legislature's parsimonious attitude toward frontier defense meant that the rangers often had to set out on a pursuit indifferently mounted and poorly provisioned. Often, like the Indians they were pursuing, they had to depend on hunting or even fishing in order to survive until they could get back. Now, though, Kicking Wolf had stolen the big horse, and all Captain Skull could think of to do was call him a genius. "What is a genius, anyway?" Augustus asked, addressing the question to the company at large. "I guess the captain's a genius. You ought to ask him," Call said. The captain, at the moment, was walking around with Famous Shoes, attempting to discover how the theft had been accomplished. "A genius is somebody with 6 toes or more on 1 foot," Longbill declared. "That's what I was told at home." Neely Dickens, a small, reedy man prone to quick darting motions that reminded Gus of minnows, took a different view. "Geniuses don't have no warts," he claimed. "In that case, I'm a genius because I am rarely troubled with warts," Augustus said. "Well, I've heard that geniuses are desperate smart," Teddy Beatty said. "I met one once up in St. Louis, and he could spell words backwards and even say numbers backwards, too." "Now, what would be the point of spelling backwards?" Augustus asked. "If you spell backwards, you wouldn't have much of a word. I expect you was drunk when you met that fella." Finch Seeger, the largest and slowest man in the company when it came to movement, was also the slowest when it came to thinking. Often Finch would devote a whole day to one thought, the thought that he wanted to go to a whorehouse, for example. He did not take much interest in the question of geniuses, but he had no trouble keeping an interest in food. Dietz had informed the company that there was only a little bacon left, and yet they were a long way from home. The prospect of baconless travel bored into Finch's mind like a screwworm, so painfully that he was moved to make a comment. "Pig," he said, to everyone's surprise. "I wish we had us a good fat pig." "Now, Finch, keep quiet," Augustus said, though the comment was the only word Finch Seeger had uttered in several days. "No one was discussing swine," Gus added. "No one was discussing anything," Call remarked. "Finch has as much right to talk as you have." Finch ignored the controversy his remark had ignited. He looked across the empty prairie, and his mind made a picture of a fat pig. The pig was nosing around behind a chaparral bush, trying to root out a mouse or perhaps a snake. He meant to be watchful during the day, so that if they came upon the pig he saw in his mind, they could kill it promptly and replenish their bacon supply. "Well, that's one less horse," Longbill commented. "I guess one of us will have to ride a pack mule unless the captain intends to walk." "I doubt he intends to walk. We're a far piece out," Call said, only to be confounded a few minutes later by the captain's announcement that he intended to do just that. "Kicking Wolf stole Hector while Hector was pissing. It was the only time he could have approached him," Skull announced to the men. "Famous Shoes figured it out. Took him while he was pissing. Famous Shoes thinks he might have whispered a spell into his ear, but I doubt that." While the rangers watched, he began to rake around in his saddlebags, from which he extracted his big plug of tobacco, a small book, and a box of matches wrapped in oilskin. He had a great gray coat rolled up behind his saddle, but after a moment's thought he left it rolled up. "Too heavy," he said. "I'll be needing to travel light. I'll just dig a hole at night, bury a few coals in it, and sleep on them if it gets nippy." Skull stuffed a coat pocket full of bullets, pulled his rifle out of its scabbard, and scanned the plain with a cheerful, excited look on his face. Actions which puzzled Call and Gus in the extreme. Captain Skull seemed to be making preparations to strike out on foot, although they were far out on the Llano, and in the winter, too. The Comanches knew where they were, Buffalo Hump and Slow Tree as well. What would induce the captain to be making preparations for foot travel? And what was the troop to do while he walked? but Skull had a cheerful grin on his bearded face. "Opportunity, men. It knocks but once," he said. I think it was Papa Franklin who said that. It's in Poor Richard, I believe. Now, adversity and opportunity are kissing cousins, I say. My horse is missing, but he's no dainty animal. He leaves a big track. I've always meant to study tracking. It's a skill I lack. Famous Shoes here is a great authority. He claims he can even track bugs. So we'll be leaving you now, gentlemen. Famous Shoes is going to teach me tracking while he follows my horse. But, Captain, what about us? Long Bill asked, unable to suppress the question. Why, go home, boys. Just go home, Captain Skull said. Just go home. No need for you to trail along while I'm having my instruction. Mr. Call and Mr. McCrae, I'll make you co-commanders. Take these fine men back to Austin and see that they're paid when you get there. The Rangers looked at one another, mightily taken aback by this development. Famous Shoes had not returned to camp. He was waiting on the plain near where the big horse had been taken. Captain Skull rummaged a little more in his saddlebags, but found nothing more that he needed. I've got to pare down to essentials, men, he said, still with his excited grin. A knife, some tobacco, my firearms, matches. A man ought to be able to walk from Cape Cod to California with no more than that, and if he can't, he deserves to die where he drops, I say. Call thought the man was mad. He was so impatient to be striking out alone into the middle of nowhere that he didn't even want to stop and give proper orders. He just wanted to leave. So, suddenly and unexpectedly, he and Augustus had been thrown into a situation they had often discussed. They were in charge of a troop of rangers, if only for the course of a homeward journey. It was what they had long desired, and yet it had arrived too suddenly. It didn't seem right. So, we are just to go home, Call said. To be sure he had it right. Yes, home, Captain Skull said. If you encounter any rank bandits along the way, hang 'em. Otherwise, get on home and wait until you hear from me. We won't hear from you, you fool, Augustus thought, but he didn't say it. What will we tell Mrs. Skull? He inquired. Why, nothing, Skull said. Inez ain't your concern, she's mine. If I were you, I'd just try to avoid her. Sir, she may be worried, Call said. The captain stopped rummaging in his saddlebags for a moment and turned his head, as if the notion that his wife might be worried about him was a novelty he had never before considered. Why, no, Mr. Call, he said. Inez won't be worried. She'll just be angry. He grinned once more at the troop, waved his hand, picked up his rifle, and strode off toward Famous Shoes, who fell in with him without a word. The two men, both short, walked away into the empty distance. Well, there they go, Woodrow, Gus said. We're captains now, I reckon. I reckon, Call said.